Good morning. Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago Sunday morning program. It's January 10th, 2021. I'm your moderator today. My name is Rick Guthman. I'm one of several rotating volunteer moderators for the Ethical Humanist Society, and one of the many volunteers that makes this program happen. We have a group of people that contribute in many ways. We have a planning committee to review and coordinate the guest speakers. We have administrative and technical teams that make this program and this education possible. We all do this volunteer work because we believe that the community we form and the education we provide can change lives in profound ways. Thank you for your contribution. None of this is possible without you. The platform today is virtual. I'm at home, the guest is at home, and our behind the scenes volunteers are at home. Out of concern for everyone, this program and all EHS activities are virtual at this point. When the time is right to safely return to in-person gatherings, we will. Let me tell you something about our society. At the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago, we value the importance of living an ethical, responsible, and joyful life. We promote intellectual, philosophical, and artistic freedom, avoiding dogma and rigid creed. We nurture a sense of wonder about life, nature, and the universe. We are inspired by positive models of human achievement, shaped by the forces of humanism, democracy, and science, and religious reform. We cherish human diversity. We focus on what we have in common, not what keeps us apart. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Hector Garcia. After Professor Garcia concludes his presentation, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. You're invited to submit questions for the Q&A into the comment sections of the YouTube feed. So, Hector Garcia, a clinical psychologist, is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, and a clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He's published extensively on the treatment of PTSD in combat veterans. He's also published on the masculine identity in the aftermath of war, stress, and the rank in organization, and the interplay between religious practice and psychopathology. He's written 2 books, Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression, and most recently, Sex, Power, and Partisanship, How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and science. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing program related to both science and politics, and maybe religion as well. I want to let you know that we will have a musical interlude after the presentation and before our Q&A. So at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Hector Garcia.
Morning. Thanks for having me. It seems like a really good time to talk about the current topic. The past 4 years, culminating in the past week, have been a sobering experience for the entire world. By this point, none of us require much convincing to see that our political psychology can be prone to intense, volatile emotions and utter irrationality. We all know how much our political stances can be prone to bias. As a researcher, I'm dedicated to the scientific method because it is the best tool that we have to overcome bias in our quest to understand. What I love about the evolutionary sciences in particular is that they're so good at providing clear, ultimate explanations for otherwise irrational human behavior. They tell us the evolved purpose of a certain behavior, the why. So I think that the current situation is a perfect case study for an evolutionary lens, because surface level explanations have left us with a lot of confusion. Donald Trump, for example, he has botched Bible passages with his 2 Corinthians, his 3 marriages. He's been caught on audio boasting that he tried to have sex with married women, and that because of his fame, he could grab women by the genitals, violating so many cherished values of the political right: sexual restraint, devotion to marriage, religion. Yet he got 20% of the evangelical vote in 2016. I'm sorry, 80% and 81% in 2020. Another motivation is that we have seen a measurable surge in violence against ethnic and religious minorities from his campaign forward, and of course the occupation of the Capitol building last week. Most of it directly relatable to Trump's rhetoric. Now, before I go any further, I just want to say whenever we study evolutionary science, we have to be careful not to commit what is called the naturalistic fallacy. The mistaken idea that just because something may be arrived at through evolutionary means, through genetic means, that it's necessarily moral, desirable, or inevitable. In many cases, it's none of those things. And in many cases, we have the power to overcome our impulses. Every piece of technology that we have is evidence of this. And that's why it's important to study this field. But the point is to use these sciences to finally make sense of our political divisions by explaining just what are political orientations in the first place. To begin, let's start with an unlikely source for psychological insight: the popular media. Political commentator and talk show host Chris Matthews once called Republicans the daddy party and Democrats the mommy party. As it turns out, that take was more accurate than you might think. Although there's little research on this topic, the one study that systematically looked at this idea asked subjects how much they were likely to identify with stereotypical male or female adjectives, such as understanding, sympathetic, loves children, compassionate, gentle. For female gender roles, or forceful, strong personality, assertive, aggressive, etc. for stereotypical male gender roles. Now, what this study found was that men and women who score high on femininity were more likely to identify as Democrat. And men and women who scored high on masculinity were more likely to identify as Republican. The same patterns were found in the 2008 presidential and 2010 congressional elections. Masculine men and women voted Republican, and feminine men and women voted Democrat. Now, this was a study of gender, and gender often describes masculine or feminine traits that may be expressed independent of sex, which is very often shaped by culture. There's a lot of value to seeing orientations in terms of gender because on the grand scheme of things, men and women show far more similarities than differences. And the overlap that they show is typically what we think of as gender. Put simply, the sensitive men and aggressive women. But there are sex-based leanings. Women, for example, tend to support liberal candidates and policies more than men. Here's one example of this. This picture is of the 2018 US Congress. And you can see the obvious differences. Out of that Congress, you have 110 women, and 81 of those women are Democrat, 29 are Republican. what I have found is that the differences between left and right go far deeper than just gender, but they're related to sex. And not only are they related to sex, but they're related to our oldest instincts to survive and to reproduce. Now, what I've learned is that the survival pressures of our ancestral past have honed our political orientations. And the pressures I focus on in my book are the violence of outside tribes, germs, and the challenges of rearing human offspring into adulthood, which is an enormous task for humans. These pressures on our biology shaped our politics. For time's sake, I'm not going to have the chance to talk about germs or rearing human offspring. It's mostly going to be about the pressures of outside tribes. So one inkling that we get that our orientations are rooted in our biology is that when we query people around the world about their political orientation and graph their responses tend to fall on the natural curve. And that curve represents natural selection at work in a population. For example, if we were to graph fear sensitivity, it would fall on the natural curve. Too much fear, and we wouldn't take necessary risks required for survival. Too little fear, and we're going to take too many risks and get culled from the gene pool. We would earn what has been called the Darwin Award. Most of us fall somewhere in between. Now, as it turns out, political orientation is a very robust predictor across numerous studies of where one falls on this curve. The higher fear sensitivity one has, the more politically conservative they tend to be, and vice versa for political liberalism. Now, very relevant to today's topic is where people vary on this dimension. So, xenophilia is the attraction to new people. Xenophobia is the fear of new people. Across our evolutionary history, there were advantages and disadvantages to both. Xenophilia allowed our ancestors to acquire new knowledge, new goods, new technologies, and new genes. It helped us to avoid inbreeding. Because our ancestral past was very violent, xenophobia also had its advantages, and it protected people against attack, avoiding the dangerous outside tribes, for example. Now, one of the most robust predictors of where one falls on this curve is where they fall politically. I think you need to push the next slide on this one. There we go. This is, like I mentioned, one of the most robust predictors around the globe. Studies around the globe find that the more politically, well, I should say, the more xenophobic you are, the more likely you are to be politically conservative. The more xenophilic you are, the more likely you are to be politically liberal. And I think explaining that in that direction is important because our evolved fears far predated anything such that we see in the world of modern politics today. So, what we find is that liberals, for example, are more likely to be interested in other cultures, travel more, speak a foreign language, enjoy ethnic foods more, listen to world music more, and vice versa for people who are conservative. People who are conservative tend to travel less, be less interested in speaking foreign languages or talking with people from foreign countries. And keep in mind, think probabilistically. This does not mean that you're not going to find conservatives who don't travel the world, and vice versa for liberals. But in general, we see this trend across the globe. So an important point to consider is that we should pay attention to how political rhetoric taps into our evolved fears, especially those that elicit xenophobia. Because xenophobia is at the heart of what tears societies apart. Xenophobia is at the heart of what we saw last week in the news. To better understand xenophobia, we have to see that in our past, intergroup violence was staggeringly common, and the evidence is overwhelming. Archaeological evidence reveals massacre after massacre after massacre site. Intergroup violence among hunter-gatherers is incredibly high. In some societies, you see up to 30% of men are killed by the outside tribes. So those massacres were almost exclusively committed by outside men. So one thing to consider is that the biggest threat to from other humans has been not only lone men, but male coalitions. Since we were hunter-gatherers, across our history, across contemporary times, across every social strata and culture, it's been groups of outside men, coalitions of outside men. This threat is very ancient. This slide shows a coalition of male chimpanzees on their way to make war on the rival troop. So the biggest defense against male coalitions has been our own coalitions of males, whether we're talking militaries or the male alliances that control them. Now, what I argue is that conservatism was adapted to deal with the threat of outside tribes. And it's no surprise that conservatives are more territorial, build the wall, more xenophobic, more hawkish in their foreign policy stances, and more male-oriented. Generally speaking, more likely to form male alliances. Now, one concept that is very critical to understand what I'm talking about here is what's called right-wing authoritarianism. This is a concept designed by or developed by a team of scientists in the aftermath of World War II who were trying to figure out what gave the world Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, is one of the best psychological measures of the underlying psychology of political conservatism. This has three factors that bear paying close attention to. One is submission to authority figures. The next is conformity to social conventions and rules, which are often set by the authority figures. Another is high aggression against outsiders, which is often sanctioned by authority figures. So, if conservatism is an ancient adaptation to the threat of male coalitions, then we would expect to see evidence of it in the sector of society that is tasked with defending against them. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. In the military, submission to authority is a central feature of rank structure. Unquestioning obedience in the combat theater is necessary to coordinate action. How quickly would an army get slaughtered if decision-making was democratic, if soldiers were not especially obliged to obey commands? As is conformity and rule following. High conformity, military dress, military jargon, military haircuts and formations, but also in conformity to rules and procedures, both of which are necessary not only for coordinating action on the battlefield, but for maintaining order again among testosterone-filled young males. Obviously, the third RWA factor, aggression against outsiders, is the very purpose of militaries. So Supporting this hypothesis, research found that after the 9/11 attacks, even liberals saw a more conservative shift in their politics, and that witnessing a death or injury among those in New York City predicted a higher right-wing authoritarianism score. Again, the male flair of political conservatism was shaped by violence. So why do we fight in the first place? Well, we live in a world of finite resources. And in our ancestral past, starvation was very common. We were far less adept at extracting resources from our environment as we are today. So as tribes, we competed for resources and territory with other tribes. Many times, competition for resources were zero-sum games, meaning that one group's loss was the other group's gain. So another important concept to understand when we look at the psychology of political conservatism is something called social dominance orientation. And this is another psychological measure, and it measures exactly what it sounds like, the extent to which one wants his or her group to have a dominance position over the next group. Now, another huge difference between liberals and conservatives, which we see again across the globe, is the emphasis on egalitarianism versus hierarchy. Liberals tend to emphasize equality, and conservatives tend to emphasize hierarchy. This emphasis on hierarchy or inequality is based largely on male competitive psychology, which I unpackaged a lot more in the book. So one thing that, at this point may becoming more intuitive is that across the globe, across age, across gender, across nationality, religion, income level, education level, and political ideology, men score far higher on this than women. Much as we would expect, because if men were largely in charge with competing violently against outside tribes as they have throughout our history as a species. So this has great implications for foreign policy, for domestic policy stances. So especially around issues concerning access to resources by those who are perceived as outsiders. So social dominance orientation is negatively correlated with support for affirmative action, social welfare programs, which often equals the playing field for minorities, for those who may be perceived as outsiders. It has implications for foreign policy. Social dominance orientation is highly correlated with patriotism. So in other words, if your psychology is more geared towards fighting outside groups of men for dominance, you're going to favor insiders. You're going to be more tribalistic. Now, with all of this said, let us take another look at the group that stormed the Capitol building last week. There's a glaring demographic trend that we often overlook because it's so natural. And I wonder if anybody can see it. This is a tribe of almost exclusively men. Many of them are armed. They're ceding up control, ceding up authority to a dominant male that has convinced them that something was stolen from them. Recall that social dominance orientation is based on largely male competition for resources. Perhaps a bigger question is why they believe it. For this, we need to take another look at the right-wing authoritarianism factor, submission to authority figures. So our choice of leaders is very ancient, and it's based on the need for protection and alliance making. Consider which of these demographics you would prefer as an ally in a fight, or just in a dangerous environment such as the ones in which we evolved, surrounded by predators, surrounded by outside tribes who are waiting to ambush us. Would it be this person? This guy? That little guy? Him? Or him? The choice is pretty obvious. And indeed, in hunter-gatherer groups, big men, leaders of the tribe, were very often big men. They were very often larger men. In their research lab, subjects show a preference for taller leaders. One study of over 200 years of US presidential elections found that the taller of the US presidential candidates won the vast majority of the time, and in every election, both candidates were taller than the average US citizen. Height is very important. It predicts status in labor markets, white collar versus blue collar jobs, higher position in the church hierarchy, whether one's a bishop or a priest, for example, and even higher reproductive success. Taller men tend to have more children than shorter men. Now, what I want you to think about is that political operatives know this research. Consider how Donald Trump has framed his political opponents. Okay.
ABC this morning. I don't watch it much, but I'm watching in the morning. And they have little George Stephanopoulos talking to Nikki Haley, right? Little George.
Little Marco, little Marco. Do you know that in Florida, they hate little Marco Rubio so much?
Little Rocket Man.
This is very ancient and it's very emotionally intuitive, and that is why leaders will go out of their way to describe their fighting prowess. Even though today, none of our leaders would ever actually physically represent us in a fight. Especially somebody like Donald Trump, who lived a soft life of comfort and privilege and got multiple draft deferments for bone spurs. It happens on the left and the right. Justin Trudeau and Putin, for example, have filmed themselves working out in a boxing gym. And here we have a pretty hilarious claim by Ben Carson.
ABC this morning.
As a teenager, I would go after people with rocks and bricks and baseball bats and hammers. And of course, many people know the story when I was 14 and I tried to stab someone.
Yeah, I don't know if any of us believe that. But the point is, none of this is hidden, but it's intentionally broadcast. All of what I just explained is critical for understanding how we got here. So, if you have a sector of the population that is dispositionally more fearful and more likely to defer to authority than the large, loud chest thumpers among our political leaders, are going to resonate very deeply, especially when they posit a threat and they promise protection. This is how our evolutionary impulses are used to con us. And it happens at the neurological level. Fear engages very primitive centers of the brain, survival centers of the brain, such as the amygdala, that override the rational thinking centers of the brain, such as the cortex. Now, interestingly, research finds that conservatives, highly partisan conservatives in particular, have larger amygdala, the larger fear centers of the brain. This is a critically important vulnerability. Research has found, for example, that conservatives are more vulnerable to believe false information, especially when that false information posits a threat. It also finds that conservatives believe and share fake news more on social media than liberals, especially when it posits a threat. Now, clearly, this is a matter of degree and not kind. Those people on the left have the same vulnerabilities, but there is a demonstrable difference in scope. Manipulate the populace. Often for financial gain, we've heard falsehoods involving fear, such as the Obama administration's healthcare plan included death panels to decide on who gets euthanized. Fear. President Obama is a Muslim, i.e., he's from the outside tribe. That the Democrats, the outside tribe, stole the 2020 election, or that COVID is a hoax created by the rival tribe to obstruct our livelihood. Once again, manufacturing fear or positing a threat followed by promising protection. This is a known con among researchers called the fear then release technique. Now, I want to go back to the 2016 elections, debates rather, to show you how this technique is used to manipulate. In this case, to deflect attention away from Trump's misbehavior, because he was very clearly instructed to use this technique when his misbehavior was brought up. He does it almost robotically. Pay close attention to what he does every time he gets called out on the issue of trying to grab women's genitals.
As a teenager.
We received a lot of questions online, Mr. Trump, about the tape that was released on Friday. As you can imagine, you called what you said locker room banter. You described kissing women without consent, grabbing their genitals. That is sexual assault. You bragged that you have sexually assaulted women. Do you understand that?
No, I didn't say that at all. I don't think you understood what was said. This was locker room talk. I'm not proud of it. I apologize to my family. I apologize to the American people. Certainly, I'm not proud of it. But this is locker room talk. You know, when we have a world where you have ISIS chopping off heads, where you have, and frankly, drowning people in steel cages, where you have wars and horrible, horrible sights all over, where you have so many bad things happening. This is like medieval times. We haven't seen anything like this, the carnage all over the world. And they look and they see. Can you imagine the people that are, frankly, doing so well against us with ISIS?
Fear then release.
A lot of questions.
Yes, I'm very embarrassed
online,
by it.
Mr. Trump,
I
about
hate
the tape
it, but it's locker room talk, and it's one of those things.
Here he does it again.
Knock the hell out of ISIS. We're going to defeat ISIS. ISIS happened.
And again.
But I have tremendous respect for women.
Have you ever done those
women
things?
Have respect for me. And I will tell you, no, I have not. And I will tell you that I'm going to make our country safe. We're going to have borders in our country, which we don't have now. People are pouring into our country, and they're coming in from the Middle East and other places. We're going to make America safe again. We're going to make America great again, but we're going to make America safe again.
Okay. So the other RWA factor, conformity, is also critical to help us understand how a person, a sector of the populace, can maintain false beliefs. So we have come to learn that genes can ensure that copies of themselves get replicated even when those copies reside in another individual. This is why we're so prone to helping our genetic relatives, even at a cost to ourselves. Read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. But humans are very skilled at extending cooperation far beyond their genetic kin through a process called reciprocal altruism, helping non-kin with the expectation that later on that fitness enhancing help will later be reciprocated. To avoid cheating on this exchange, helping somebody when help isn't given back, we often show signals of commitment to the tribe to ensure, to build trust. Those signals can often come in the form of behaviors such as harsh initiation rites, as we see in tribal societies, feats of endurance or bravery, or ritualistic scarring or branding or tattooing. Cheaters are much less likely to endure these painful rituals, whereas completing them assures the tribe of sincerity. Sometimes these rituals are what is known as badges, common colors, tribal regalia, military uniforms, which makes cooperators more easy to identify. We have not escaped the need for tribal colors in the modern day, and they tend to be more concentrated among the more tribalistic among us. Now, sometimes a show of commitment to the tribe can be sticking to an idea, such as a political ideology or a religious canon. Unfortunately, sometimes those ideas can be patently absurd. We could go on and on and on about the talking snakes, the burning bushes, the winged horses of religion that people are socially pressured to profess belief in. Tragically, there are more recent examples in the case of COVID-19. Denying COVID-19, especially in the United States, has become a badge of tribal commitment among those with a greater need to conform to the tribe. Now, there are many reasons why conformity matters. It's useful to coordinate action like we talked about, but there is also a very powerful fear of not conforming that deserves our attention. In our ancestral past, being abandoned or rejected by the tribe would have been a death sentence. Imagine being dropped off virtually naked and alone in the middle of the Serengeti. How long would we last? So we have evolved a fear of going against the tribe, of not conforming. Now, there is more. In his new book, The Goodness Paradox, evolutionary biologist or anthropologist Richard Wrangham makes a rock-solid case for the idea that humans domesticated themselves by systematically executing members of their tribe that were overly aggressive, executing them, or who aggressively broke tribal rules. Unfortunately, we know that sometimes cultural rules can be arbitrary, and sometimes people can be persecuted for the most inane infractions, even some things like suspected witchcraft. So even more evolutionary pressures shaping the fears of nonconformity. Now, the human brain comes equipped with sensitive cheater detection modules. And that may sound ironic given what I've just said, but as a species, as a social species, we have a remarkable ability to understand other minds, to understand that other people have intentions, beliefs, or even false beliefs. One line of research has suggested that because of this, we tend to conceal our own beliefs from ourselves to keep them from being detected by our tribe mates. Now, if the consequence would be execution by our tribe, self-deception could be essential. So it may be, and I think there's more research needed on this, and who knows, this may be the topic of the third book that I write, but it may be that all of the absurdities and falsehoods that have come from this previous administration may have taken such hold in the more tribalistic members of our society because of self-deception, especially in those of among us whose brains are more geared evolutionarily to conformity. So, one of the biggest things I want you to take away from this talk or any of my talks is that if you don't understand your evolved psychology, others who do are going to use it to manipulate you. And sometimes that will come from other nations, from our enemies, but sometimes it also comes from within. But understanding our evolved psychology, it actually serves our country. It actually helps us keep our leaders accountable. It actually gives us greater freedom, because when we understand our evolved psychology, we have the greater capacity to make more conscious, more rational choices. Political choices are among those. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Much appreciated. So there's going to be a brief musical interlude, and this is an opportunity for the people watching to contribute in two ways. So we're going to have, after the interlude, a Q&A question. So please start entering questions into the chat box. And during the interlude, also please consider contributing to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. Contributions are collected through either our website, ethicalhumanistsociety.org/donate, or using Zelle, donate to ethicalhuman.org. It's through your generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs in the society are. We suggest $5 or any amount you're comfortable with is greatly appreciated. We appreciate all who sustain the society with their donations of time and money. And now for a brief musical interlude. Hello, welcome back. So just a reminder of how we're going to do this, and maybe to help Hector too, who's new to our society. Svetlana, behind the scenes, is reading the questions and vetting them. Not necessary for everyone to know that, but I just wanted to make sure. So you can still continue as we ask questions. You can continue to submit more questions, write them as concisely as possible so that we can post them, and I will read them for Hector. So Hector, you don't have to read the chat box and try to figure out which questions. I'll queue them up, but keep putting them in there. Ask them as concisely as you can so that we can get through as many as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and start. First question is, can you talk about the difference between the instinct to repel or eliminate the other as a defense mechanism and the desire to subjugate the other?
Well, I can try. I think they're pretty closely related, to be honest. I mean, subjugating the other. I think what has happened across our evolutionary history has been more where you see groups of hunter-gatherers attacking the outside tribe, killing all the men and taking the women, as their spoils of war. Perhaps they get subjugated, but slavery's been common too. I mean, really, it's about achieving a dominance position over the outside tribe and sequestering resources. So I think they're very similar. As I think maybe as you see and as we grow into these enormous megalopolises, giant societies that grow way beyond our the tribalistic structures that we evolved in. Maybe we can't go to the rival neighborhood and kill everybody and take their women, but subjugating them is another way to compete. So I think you see that play out in that respect. If I understand that correctly, that question correctly, I don't know.
Sure, thank you. Next question. Wealth is highly correlated with conservative attitudes. How does that fit in with your theory that emphasizes RWA as a dominant factor in the right-left differences?
Well, it can be correlated. I think one way to look at orientations as our political orientations is there a psychology that helped us navigate the social dominance hierarchy. So when you're people on the right tend to favor the status quo, and it's usually people who have more of a privileged position. Not always, and again, we got to think probabilistically. So and if you are in a privileged position, that psychology that sticks with the status quo, that is geared towards wanting a dominance position over the rival group, that's going to serve you. Liberalism is far more supported by people who experience greater subjugation, like women or ethnic minorities. That kind of psychology would help you rise up the dominance hierarchy. So we evolved as social animals for whom position on the hierarchy meant resources, or access to resources, which has implications for our genetic fitness. So that's how these things get played out.
Okay. Next question. Can compassion and empathy evolve only in the context of plenty? Can they be cultivated even when people experience scarcity of basic resources?
Oh, sure. Yes, I think so. The simple answer, yes. Sure. I mean, you have people who are impoverished who show incredible acts of kindness to one another. The bigger question is how much that can be extended to the rival tribe, the rival group. There's archaeological research showing that periods of scarcity, you see more evidence of warfare in periods of scarcity, which we can, deduce from looking at the massacre sites and looking at, evidence of starvation in the bones, or evidence of drought in the strata, for example. That's I think a bigger question. But again, we tend to have more empathy towards in-group members than out-group members, and especially if our psychology, if our underlying psychology is more geared towards focusing inward toward the tribe.
What was it about Obama and his message that enabled him twice to overcome the xenophobia?
Oh gosh, that's a good. Who knows? He was smart. He was tall. He came at the right moment. We were, had just gone through a couple of wars that people highly disagreed on. So I don't know. Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. I voted for him.
Do you know whether the adaptations you have so compellingly outlined are genetic, nature, or cultural, nurture?
They're both. I mean, looking at twin studies, I think I'm trying to remember the figure. Maybe 40% of our political behavior is due to genetic influences, which leaves a lot of room for culture. It's never either or. Both culture and our genes, operate on one another. Something that some of the founders of evolutionary psychology often say is that 3 pounds of oatmeal don't learn, but 3 pounds of brain do. So even learning happens through our brain, which we developed through the processes of natural selection. So it's always both.
Okay. Politicians in the Western world have become noticeably coarse during the last decade. Are there social and environmental factors which help us understand increasing political polarization? My screen jumped. Yeah. Are there social? Yeah.
Well, the parties were the 2 parties here in the U.S. were far more alike for many, many decades. I think some of the things that made them more polarized was the rise of conservative and politically oriented news outlets, the massive exodus of people, of Southern Democrats to the Republican Party after the Civil Rights Movement, things like that. But when you have a candidate who rises up and uses all this, this rhetoric, that's all the chest thumping, other people respond in turn. I think during the 2016 debates, all these candidates were talking about how tough they were, how much they fought. Democratic candidate Jim Webb boasted on during the debates about killing a enemy soldier in Vietnam. I think that has an impact too. Where other candidates start vying for top alpha, position. So it's a number of factors, and a lot of them are very ancient. A lot of them are very ancient and very emotion driven.
Physical might, physical strength, is increasingly unrelated to meeting basic human needs for living. How do evolutionary signals change to reflect that change and value other social signals of status and success?
There are other social signals of status and success: wealth, intelligence, compassion, but do they change? They're surprisingly enduring, and that may fall into what is called an evolutionary mismatch. There are some adaptations that were really better honed for our ancestral environments that we just haven't lost because we occupied those ancestral environments just within an eye blink of time, relatively speaking. So we carry forward these adaptations that don't apply a great deal in the modern day. But research has found that in times of stress and times when there's in the research lab, when an outside threat is posited, that we tend to be drawn to more masculine leaders with more masculine facial features, even female leaders with more masculine facial features. When cooperation is needed, in-group cooperation is needed, we tend to be drawn to more feminine leaders, men and women with more feminine facial features.
Question is, it occurs to me that some autocratic leaders and dictators were rather small. Hitler, for example, Napoleon. So how did they control, I guess, their surroundings? Being bombastic, making the other even smaller, though dangerous? Or,
yeah, and again, it's not, I mean, there are other factors too. There are other factors besides, I mean, we can't think too concretely about evolutionary impulses. They occur within a milieu of other impulses, but sometimes people will enhance how they look by speaking on a giant podium way above the crowd, as Hitler did. Joseph Stalin wore platform shoes to appear larger, for example, and it changed his name to from, I can't even pronounce his original name in Russian, but he changed it to Joseph Stalin, which means man of steel. So even people on the left, in perhaps intuitively, know what appeals to the masses.
You've ascribed conformity to the right, but it seems to me that the demand for conformity on certain issues is very strong on the American left as well. So this feature seems quite universal to humanity.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question that there are calls to conform on the left, and sometimes those calls to conform are restricted and are restrictive and not logical. So for example, looking at any criticism of Islam as a religion, as Islamophobia, for example, there's all kinds of examples. I think each group has its own natural curve. Each group, even though one may be shifted more to the left and one may be shifted towards the right, but even among liberal societies, liberal groups, liberal tribes, you're going to have people who are more tribalistic among those groups that are going to require adherence to group norms. No question. We're all tribalists. I think it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of who is more likely to to go against the tribal norms. And one idea is that psychology, to question tribal norms, to be interested in other people, is what allowed us to populate the globe, to allowed us to leave our natal lands, to go interface with other humans, to interbreed, to discover new lands, and learn new norms, right? Learn new cultural norms. That would have been an advantage. But yes, they're most definitely, like, what I was talking about was a focus on the political right, just because of really what we've seen over the past 4 years. In my opinion, demands that focus. But there most definitely are these expectations across every sector of humanity.
As we evolve, I guess this is quite a bit of speculation, but as we evolve, might women and men be closer together instead of separated by extremes of feminist and masculinity, especially as more men are involved in childcare and most women in the workforce?
Yes, sure. I think culture can accentuate those differences to a greater or lesser extent. No question.
Would this occur in any sort of time span that we could see?
Sure. I mean, how much have gender role norms changed over the past century? They've changed tremendously. There are political structures that political and religious institutions that emphasize male or female gender role norms and reproductive psychology to a greater or lesser extent. There's research that I talk about in the book about countries that are the most politically conservative tend to be Muslim majority, and embedded in both the secular and religious aspects of governance in those countries, you see male reproductive priorities emphasized. So there's a lot of mate guarding, not letting women leave the house without a chaperone, for example, access birth control, for example. All of these differences really are tied greatly to our reproductive psychology, and that's something I unpack in the book. It's very ancient.
Discourse across the aisle seems almost impossible anymore. Do you see any way to talk to someone so invested in subjugation to illegitimate authority?
It's hard, right? I mean, I think, first of all, I think we need to institute, as a mandatory part of public education, institute critical thinking skills, training in critical thinking skills. That needs to be part of the curricula. Something similar was done in post-World War II Germany. How to thoughtfully question authority, how to think critically. We don't get taught that. And throughout our history, there have been moneyed, politically powerful interests that have not wanted that. They want to keep the populace not questioning, because not questioning authority figures literally means not questioning in many cases. How many times in our past, in our history, have books been banned or burned, or only have access to one book? We need to teach critical thinking skills, but also, attacking something directly, head on, telling somebody their beliefs are stupid, never works. It just pokes that tribalistic psychology that makes people even more defensive. For a good model of how to talk to people using Socratic questioning, how to not inflame these ancient, emotionally powerful responses. Look at street epistemology. Look that up. You can see examples of how to talk to people in more productive ways who may not agree with your perspective.
The rising fear of people of color, black and brown, racism essentially, seems to be important in our modern day in the US, but not necessarily, for example, in Canada and EU countries. Do you see it this way? Is there a comment on that? Is this a US phenomenon more?
I think so. Sure. I think look, we're all tribalists, and there I'm sure are racist, xenophobic people in Canada, but the overall tenor seems to be more of acceptance, and our political system can emphasize that to a more or greater, a more or lesser extent, and we've seen over the past 4 years how white supremacists are good, are fine people. Their rhetoric can, especially from a dominant male at the top of the hierarchy with a lot of visibility, can absolutely shape the behavior and the positions of those beneath him or her. So that's a big factor. There are other factors too. There was a really fascinating study that has to do with germ theory, saying that, stating that, or positing that political conservatism may be based on fear of germs too, because the biggest vectors of disease in our ancestral past especially were outside people. Outside people could come into our tribe with something as simple as the common cold and wipe out an entire tribe. Well, interestingly, there is research showing a correlation with proximity to the equator and political conservatism. The further you get away from the equator, in general, the less politically conservative you are. Well, the germ load is higher the closer you get to these warmer climates, closer to the equator. So I think that's just fascinating. There are factors influencing our political psychology that we're just not aware of a lot of the times. But that's why I think it's important to bring these factors to the surface for rational examination, because we can see how irrational political behavior can be and inexplicable. Like, why do people behave like this? How many times have we asked ourselves that? There are reasons. We need to pull them up to the surface and make them conscious.
Next question relates to your expertise in PTSD. As an expert on PTSD, what long-term effects do you see arising from our COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I don't know if I see any. I know a lot of my patients say, I don't even notice. This is perfect because I don't have to leave the house, So I don't know if I see any long-term effects. I will tell you that treatments are highly effective. So I always try to plug the evidence-based psychotherapies that we have that are very efficacious, called prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy. So those therapies, you can hear more about these on my TED Talk, but the short version is that those therapies, when you're done with treatment, most people don't meet criteria for the disorder. So long-term effects tend to be negated once you get the proper treatment. Doesn't matter if it was 50 years ago when you experienced a trauma or 5 or 2.
How do we reassure MAGA followers that we had a non-rigged election?
Oh, I mean, see, back to what I was saying earlier. I mean, I think we need a massive campaign, a massive change in our educational system to teach people media literacy. There's so much misinformation today. And sometimes that misinformation is coming from outside sources, is coming from other countries. We know this. So we need to be taught how to sift through the morass that comes through the airwaves and understand it and think critically about it. I mean, it's a tough one. And people on the right, our political leaders need to come forth and say, no, this was not rigged. More people need to stand up to their tribe in Congress, for example, and say, look, these are legit results. We see that to a greater or lesser extent sometimes.
What do you think of the view that academia and U.S. culture are basically dominated by the left, and this leads to reasonable fear reaction by the right? And this is in light of that much of the government institution it's not true of.
Well, to a certain extent, that's true. I think what I talk about in my book is that's actually there are different academic specialties that tend to favor the right or the left that have to do with male typical psychology. So people who are more politically conservative, the short version, you'll have to read the book for more information, but the short version is that people who tend to go into fields such as engineering or math or something of that nature tend to be more politically conservative, and whereas the liberal arts tend to be more people tend to be more liberal. But yeah, I mean, I think we need more science literacy. I think we need people. I think science has become targeted by the political right over the past 4 years. Mistrust the science, and people have been very suspicious of science. But what I love about science is it has built-in mechanisms to prevent bias. Peer review. Oh my gosh, just try to get something through peer review. It can be an arduous process. So I think we need to focus more on science to inform our political opinions and our political decisions.
Religions differ in the extent that they demand conformity. How is it that some religions can be very successful despite that?
I'm not sure that I mean, I think the more successful religions demand conformity. I mean, just look at Islam. Islam is growing fast, and if you leave the religion, a penalty can be execution. I'm not 100% sure I agree with that. I think the more successful group of any kind has, you're expected to conform to in-group norms.
Can Biden or any president be viewed as a strong leader for MAGA types without resorting to these old power tropes?
That has yet to be seen. Yeah, I mean, I remember watching a video of Biden saying that he'd like to take Trump back behind the bleachers, and suggesting they'd like to beat him up. So maybe not. There are some, there's a certain sector of the population that responds more to that kind of rhetoric. So can we do without it? I hope so, because it's irrelevant to today's world. I mean, we're moving towards a world that is increasingly connected globally through economies, through tech, and it requires not chest thumping and trying to portray oneself as a badass. It requires cooperation. It requires diplomacy increasingly. So I hope so.
As a final question, try to respect your time here. Slightly off subject, that what we've been talking about, but what is your experience with becoming working as a psychologist and now a media celebrity? I know it's sort of broad, but maybe some comments on your experience becoming an author and appearing on venues like ours.
Well, a media celebrity would not be accurate, but maybe a teacher, so to speak. I mean, this is a great format for reaching people. I mean, there are the major news outlets tend to avoid controversial topics, and so sometimes you have to take the bullhorn into your own hands, and I think that's why I appreciate what people like you are doing, or people who are going on YouTube and offering a counter narrative to all the conspiracy theory nonsense that is out there. It's yet to be seen how that plays out. How all these algorithms work to bring things into our living room, and whether we can counter all the misinformation that's streaming into our homes. I hope so. I hope so.
Dr. Garcia, I much appreciate your time answering all of our questions. I'm going to make some announcements, but you'll only hear my clapping, but there's another 60 people out there listening, and this is going to be available on YouTube soon, and you can go to Dr. Garcia's YouTube site as well to get more information. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure.
Yeah, great. As a final note, be safe, stay home, and when you have to go out, wear a mask, keep your distance, and keep moving. Have a great day. Thank you.